It's been about a year since I bred Panda Corydoras, and in that time I've collected a few more species to work with. My goal going forward has been to figure out how broadly applicable those methods are that I used with the stirby. Pandas were the first to start spawning for me, so that's what we'll talk about today. I started with a group of 6 young adults, and I want to emphasize that just like the stirby, it was 5 or 6 months of additional growth and maturity before I saw any breeding behavior. In this group, I have 2 females and 4 males, and what I look for to tell them apart is some portion of the group growing noticeably larger and especially broader. Those would be the females. To me, the difference becomes noticeable from any angle really, but it might be most obvious when viewing the fish from above. Once they've grown enough to be easily sexable, I think that's a good indicator they might start spawning soon. While the fish were growing and maturing, I would say their staple food was a good nano pellet with a fairly high protein content. Once they looked like they might be ready to start spawning, I started mixing in some foods with a higher fat content like frozen bloodworms, freeze-dried tubifex, and any leftover brine shrimp. My thinking is that foods with a higher fat content help to produce eggs with enough stored nutrients to give the fry a good head start on development. As for the tank environment, this time I went with a 10-gallon, and it worked out just fine. I used a fine sand substrate because they seemed to like it. I gave them some shelters and overhead plant cover, and once again I placed a yarn spawning mop in the direction of outflow from my filtration. We'll see how that worked out in just a moment. As for water parameters, the temperature was right around 78 degrees, fairly low in mineral hardness, but lately my pH has gone way up. All of this spawning and egg hatching happened with a pH around 7.9. I don't say that to suggest that it's ideal, I don't think that at all. If I had my way, it would be neutral. The important thing to take away is just that a high pH doesn't seem to be a deal breaker. Just like the stirby, I found that they were very likely to spawn a day or two after a water change, and as a practice I do those water changes with slightly cooler water. Nothing that would shock the fish, I'm just trying to change the overall temperature by a few degrees. With the water at 78 degrees, I would be adding water that was 70, 72, or honestly, whatever temperature my cold water is coming out of the tap, as long as it isn't extremely cold. I'm inclined to believe that this helps, though I'm not sure it even depends on the water being cooler. I've moved cories from one tank to a warmer tank and had them spawn a day or two later, so to some extent I think they're just triggered by sudden changes. One difference I noticed with pandas is that for a long time I never actually saw them spawn. I started finding eggs in the morning, but I never saw them get really active until after the lights went out. Fortunately for us, I happened to turn my tank lights on early one day, and I think I caught them right in the middle of it. Corydoras spawning behavior is total chaos, and if you'll commiserate with me for just a moment, as the guy behind the camera, this is the absolute hardest thing to film. They're all over the place. What we're seeing here are the eager males chasing a female around and competing to be the one that gets to mate. I'll be honest with you, when I saw cories doing this for the first time in person, I ran across the room to break up what I thought was a fight. I don't know what the acceptance criteria might be, but eventually the female will accept one of the males and latch onto his side in what we call the T position. As odd as this may be, that's the male in the back and the female in the front. He releases milt, and by some means it's transported down to an egg, now held between the female's ventral fins. Most of the time they did this under one of the shelters or in the shadows in the back of the tank, but I did manage to capture a couple. Afterward, the females always seem a bit stunned. Maybe it's a bit of extra time for fertilization to finish, maybe she's rethinking some life choices, I'm not sure. But they always seem to sit still for a moment before taking off to find a place to deposit the egg. They tend to explore much of the tank, and if you happen to have some plants, I think it's always worth checking afterward to see if any eggs were stashed on the underside of a leaf. Just like the stirby though, the vast majority of eggs ended up in the direction of water flow. I didn't catch this spawn until long after I had already pulled eggs and raised fry, so I didn't have the spawning mop in place. Instead, the females placed clusters of eggs directly on the glass. In this instance they were fairly spread out, but in several others I found them piled on top of each other. They did use the spawning mop when it was available, but to be fair, they seemed a little less likely to place eggs directly on the mop itself. I found plenty of eggs in it, but an equal number would be placed directly behind it, and that has its own utility. It didn't do me any favors for removing them, but it did help to keep them hidden from the other cories who, if given the opportunity, would eventually eat them. My typical approach is to remove any eggs and place them somewhere safe to hatch. I removed some from the glass, a few more from under plant leaves, and then picked out whatever I found in the spawning mop. Cory eggs are adhesive, and especially so during the first hours after they're laid. When possible, I like to re-adhere them to the side of a hatching container. They don't all stick, but that's fine. Mostly I'm just trying to keep them spread out. With the eggs safe in a specimen container, I like to hang them on the inside of a tank to keep the water warm. I also run an airline tube down near the bottom to keep the water circulating. Some of these eggs will have been infertile from the start, and there's nothing we can do about that. My goal here is to keep the fertile eggs healthy by preventing debris from accumulating, and I also want to avoid the development of fungal growths that may spread to and destroy other eggs. In the past, I've added methylene blue, which is a pretty good antifungal, but it has some other downsides. This time I wanted to experiment with using tannins to prevent fungus. I've heard that works, but I wanted to see for myself. Occasionally I want to make some black water, and the way I do that is by soaking alder cones in boiling water, kind of like I'm making tea. I let the water cool down, and then added some of it to my specimen container. I have to say, I'm fairly impressed by how it worked. While I waited for the eggs to hatch, I was able to see how well the tannins held off fungus. This here is exactly what I would hope to see. One egg has gone white, and without intervention, would usually be covered in fungus. Some number of eggs were clearly decaying, but fungal growth seemed about as well deterred as it would be with methylene blue. On the other hand, the dark color of these healthy eggs is exactly what you would look for in the time just before they hatch. Maybe not quite this dark, part of this is because of the tannins, but be on the lookout for a dark mottled gray color, and that should mean they're almost ready. For me, it was the end of the 4th day when eggs started hatching, and then it took one more day for some of the stragglers. They start by freeing their tails and then flail around for a while until they shake the rest of the egg off. Sometimes they can have a hard time with that second part. After the eggs hatched, I moved them into a breeding box where I would raise the fry. One thing I really enjoyed about using tannins instead of methylene blue is that there's no pressing need to change water. Methylene blue is a great antifungal, but once eggs start hatching, you really need to thin out the concentration because it does have some element of toxicity that poses more risk to fry than it does to unhatched eggs. In this case, I was able to pour the hatching water directly into a breeding box and then just let it thin out on its own later as water circulated through the box. Conventional wisdom says that Cory fry don't eat for the first day or so, and instead continue to absorb nutrients from a large egg sac. I tend to agree with that, and as a practice I don't feed until they've been free swimming for about 36 hours. You don't have to guess either at the right time to start feeding. Over the first couple of days you should be able to see the round body get thinner and the head and mouth get wider. One thing I'm trying to figure out is exactly how soon they can start eating baby brine shrimp, because that's my preferred fry food. So far my thinking is by the time they've fully absorbed their egg sacs, they've grown just enough for brine shrimp, so in most cases it can be the first food. I do think, though, that if they've eaten nothing else by that point, they reach that size completely out of gas, and there might be a few smaller fry that could struggle with a larger food. Right now I'm still choosing to use a smaller food for the first feeding because I think it's safer. What I like to do is mix a fry powder with water and then use a pipette to place it on the bottom near the fry. I think it's also important to make sure they're comfortable enough to eat. If you offer food and the fry don't seem to be eating, my recommendation is to turn the lights down or off and just go away. Certainly come back later and check on them, but remember their first priority, even more than food, is not getting eaten by a bird or a larger fish. Bright lights and overhead shadows make them feel vulnerable, so instead of eating, they might just huddle in the corners. Over time, they do get less sensitive, but I want to emphasize that outside of filming, I let them live in ambient room light only. So after that first fry powder safety day, I switched to feeding live baby brine shrimp. Once again, I would kill the lights and then come back later to find their abdomens had turned orange. That's a great thing about brine shrimp. With young and translucent fry, you never have to wonder if they're eating. You might notice I have some more eggs in here. The adults spawned again just a few days later, and I thought I would throw the eggs in here just to show that in a clean environment with flowing water, healthy eggs usually do just fine without any antifungal additives, especially if they're fairly spread out. You'll see those smaller fry mixed in with the older ones as we move forward. Once Cory's, or really any fry, are eating baby brine shrimp, you've pretty much got it made. I feed 2 or 3 times a day, whatever my schedule allows, and otherwise just keep the enclosure clean with occasional siphoning if I see too much accumulation of mulm or uneaten food. Over the next several weeks, they grew steadily, and my threshold for size was just that I could add them to a tank with some juveniles from an earlier batch and not have any risk of the new fry being eaten. I also wanted them to be large and strong enough not to be outcompeted for food. For some species, I really like using some kind of a fry rearing enclosure, but there certainly comes a time when they no longer offer any advantage over releasing the fry into a larger tank. For me, it was somewhere around 5 weeks that I moved them in with some larger fish. In the range of sizes you see here, I've started to transition to the same nano pellets I was feeding the parents. I still feed some brine shrimp to help out some of the smaller ones, but from here my goal is to put on size as fast as possible. I'm hoping to get these to a sellable size within the next 2 or 3 months maybe, and Corys eat a lot, so power feeding is a lot more cost effective with a dry food. Either way, I've got to get these grown up and moved on. I've got 2 more species ready to spawn, so it's time to start working on that. So that'll be all for Panda Corys. I'll probably show you one more look at these once they're a big chunky herd, and in the meantime, I think the next breeding video will be Apistogramma agassizii. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.